Tonight, the sound that broke the stillness over Cotonou was not gunfire, not shouting, but something far more unsettling. The quiet alarm that spreads when a nation senses that its future is shifting beneath its feet. Benin, long regarded as one of West Africa's most stable democracies, woke to a sudden coup attempt, and the tremor reached far beyond its borders. For many who have watched Africa's long struggle for sovereignty, this moment feels less like an isolated crisis and more like the continuation of a pattern we have seen repeat itself across decades. In a small neighborhood near the Porto Novo highway, an elderly shopkeeper described the night as strangely silent, the kind of silence that makes a man remember stories his father once told him about the unseen forces that move when a country refuses to bow. His words echo what many across the continent now fear, that whenever an African nation takes a step toward independence, shadows from the past begin to shift. What happened in Benin matters to every viewer listening today, especially those in America who have seen how fragile global stability can be. You have lived through the Cold War, through foreign interventions, through years when small nations became battlefields for larger ambitions. And as you watch Africa rise, nation by nation, pushing toward sovereignty in places like Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, you may sense a familiar tension in this story. Something about it rings true. Before we go deeper, let me offer a reflection for you personally. If this story stirs questions in your heart, if something about this moment feels larger than a headline, allow yourself to stay with it. Sometimes the most important truths are not the loud ones, but the quiet warnings carried by events far from home. Because the question now facing Africa is not only why Benin was targeted. The question is what this moment reveals about the forces shaping the future of an entire continent. And even more unsettling, whether Benin is the beginning of a much larger test for West Africa. In the early hours of the morning, as fishermen along the Benin coastline prepared their nets and the first buses rolled quietly through Cotonou's narrow streets, a wave of uncertainty suddenly swept across the country. What began as scattered reports of unusual troop movement near key administrative buildings quickly crystallized into something far more serious. Units that were never scheduled for deployment appeared at strategic checkpoints. Communication lines flickered. Local radio hesitated before announcing that a coup attempt was unfolding, catching an entire nation off guard. Benin had not seen this kind of coordinated internal disruption in decades, which is why the sudden escalation felt so deliberate, as if triggered by a hidden hand pulling threads from behind the curtain. At a small outpost near the border with Togo, a young soldier later described the moment his commander told him to prepare for possible engagement. He said he felt a knot tightening in his stomach, not because he feared combat, but because he did not understand whom he was being positioned against. There had been no nationwide tensions, no political standoff, no signs of hostility that would justify such drastic action. For him, the confusion felt heavier than the danger, the way a man feels when he realizes the ground beneath him is shifting and cannot tell who is moving it. As the morning unfolded, reports started describing unusual coordination among the mutineers. They were not acting alone or spontaneously. They had specific targets and a sequence of actions that suggested prior preparation. Even more telling was what local analysts noticed. The attempt did not aim to win public support or rally civilian groups. It moved quietly, surgically, as if the true audience was not the people of Benin, but someone outside the country. This was the first major clue that the crisis was part of a wider pattern, a continuation of the invisible struggle that has shaped West Africa for over half a century. In markets across Cotonou, shopkeepers debated fiercely over radio broadcasts that contradicted one another. Some claimed the coup was driven by internal factions unhappy with recent reforms. Others insisted foreign interests were behind it, pointing to the fact that the timing aligned suspiciously with Benin's growing shift toward regional cooperation, sovereignty-oriented policies, and partnerships meant to reduce reliance on external guidance. A retired teacher, now living with his daughter in the outskirts of the city, said something that resonated deeply. He recalled a similar moment years ago in another West African nation. He said, "Whenever a country begins to pursue economic independence, someone somewhere begins to shake the table." He spoke softly, but with the certainty of a man who has lived long enough to recognize recurring patterns. His words, simple yet haunting, echoed throughout the nation. Stability does not collapse without reason. To understand why Benin became vulnerable, we must examine the strategic position the country holds today. In recent years, Benin has been quietly strengthening its regional ties, participating more actively in defense coordination, and exploring partnerships that aim to reduce dependence on Western institutions. Its economy has been diversifying, its security forces have been engaging in regional operations, and its political class has begun talking more openly about sovereignty. These shifts may seem subtle to the casual observer, but to those whose power depends on Africa remaining predictable and compliant, such developments represent a direct challenge. The coup attempt emerged precisely at the moment when Benin was preparing to align more closely with independent regional blocs and nations seeking to reshape West African political identity. The timing raises uncomfortable questions, especially for viewers in the United States who remember how geopolitical influence often manifests not through open battles, but through quiet disruptions. This is the nature of influence in the modern world. It does not march in the streets. It whispers in boardrooms, military barracks, and diplomatic backchannels. It encourages doubt. It injects tension. And when it chooses to strike, it does so in ways that mask intention and create confusion. As Benin faced the unfolding events, one fact became increasingly clear. The crisis had less to do with internal instability and more to do with the consequences of standing too close to the idea of sovereignty, an idea that has swept across the Sahel and is now inspiring nations along the coast. The question that remains is not whether a coup was attempted, but who stood to benefit from the timing, the method, and the message it sent. The answer may lie not inside Benin, but in the long shadow cast across West Africa for generations. And if that shadow is beginning to move again, then the stakes for the entire region are about to rise in ways few are prepared for. But what transformed this local crisis into a regional alarm was the reaction that followed. A reaction that revealed just how many eyes were watching Benin long before the coup attempt began. As the news of the attempted coup spread beyond Benin's borders, the region entered a moment of uneasy silence, the kind that often precedes a deeper storm. What had begun as an isolated disruption inside a single nation quickly evolved into a test of political nerves across West Africa. Leaders from neighboring countries waited for clarity, Security agencies heightened their alerts, and ordinary citizens across the region refreshed their radios and phones, searching for answers that never seemed to arrive fast enough. In the capital, Cotonou, the atmosphere thickened with uncertainty. Government officials moved swiftly to contain the situation, releasing a short statement urging calm. But the tone of their message revealed something deeper. It was not simply a reassured government speaking to its people. It was a government trying to understand who had just knocked on its door. Analysts across Africa began comparing the event to familiar patterns they had observed in Mali, in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, and in Niger, where sudden instability appeared each time a country stepped closer to reclaiming its sovereignty. The parallels were unsettling. In each of those nations, foreign pressure, competing economic interests, and internal actors aligned with external agendas had quietly shaped the environment before the crisis emerged. The same rhythm now seemed to echo through Benin, turning the coup attempt into something larger than a domestic challenge. Among the people, emotions surged between fear, frustration, and a growing sense of recognition. A taxi driver in Cotonou recalled how customers spent the entire day arguing over the real forces behind the tension. Some blamed internal factions, others pointed toward influences outside the country. He said the most troubling part was that everyone felt like they were living inside a story they had heard before. A story written somewhere else. Across the ocean, in Atlanta, a middle-aged woman of Beninese heritage watched the events unfold with growing anxiety. Her mother, who had lived in Benin for decades, reminded her over the phone that similar crises had erupted in the past whenever the nation began asserting its independence too firmly. For her, the emotional weight was not only political, but deeply personal. She had seen too many nations across Africa rise with hope, only to be shaken back into instability just when progress began to take root. The coup attempt triggered responses beyond the civilian population. Within diplomatic circles, the reaction was swift but cautious. Officials from regional blocs sought to gather information, while Western media began publishing narratives that framed the event depending on political interests and familiar tropes. Some headlines described the situation as a domestic power struggle. Others suggested it was the predictable consequence of regional volatility. Almost none addressed the possibility that this crisis could be the product of strategic manipulation. African media outlets, by contrast, took a different approach. They examined the timing, the precision of the operation, and the broader political context. Commentators pointed out that the coup attempt came shortly after Benin announced new cooperative security talks with its neighbors, discussions aimed at reducing foreign reliance and enhancing regional autonomy. Those who had been observing the geopolitical shifts in Africa immediately recognized the tension building beneath the surface. The more African nations sought to control their own destiny, the more pressure seemed to appear in the form of whispers, misinformation, and engineered instability. In televised roundtables from Lagos to Accra, experts began using a phrase that would soon dominate Africa news headlines. They called the event a rehearsal of influence, a test of whether Benin could be pulled back into old alignments or whether it would resist, much like its Sahel neighbors. Political analysts also noted the timing of statements from international institutions. Some spoke of preserving stability, a word that carries different meanings depending on where one stands. For many Africans, stability has too often meant maintaining structures that benefit foreign interests rather than empowering local governance. Meanwhile, reform-minded citizens saw the sudden unrest as a deliberate attempt to slow Benin's growing confidence within the region. As these reactions intensified, the crisis took on a second life, one shaped not by the soldiers on the ground, but by the narratives emerging across continents. And in times of uncertainty, narratives hold tremendous power. They can calm a nation, or they can convince it that danger is everywhere. They can reveal the truth, or they can bury it beneath layers of political convenience. What made this moment the emotional peak of the crisis was not simply the attempted coup, but the realization shared by millions that they were witnessing yet another chapter in a long struggle between African sovereignty and external influence. It was the moment when fear and recognition merged into a single understanding. Someone had expected this, someone had prepared for this, and someone might be waiting for the next move. The question no one could ignore was simple. If this attempt failed, would the shadow behind it withdraw, or would it strike again in a different form? And as the region held its breath, a more troubling truth began to surface, one that revealed why Benin's internal shock had become a political earthquake for all of West Africa. As the dust settled from the initial shock of the coup attempt, Benin entered a stage of quiet tension that touched every corner of its society. The first visible consequence appeared in the markets. Vendors who normally greeted customers with lively chatter spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at radios perched beside their stalls. Even minor disruptions can disturb market prices in West Africa, and within hours, the cost of basic staples like rice, tomatoes, and fuel had edged upward. For families living on thin margins, these small shifts carried heavy weight. A mother of 3 in Cotonou described how she hesitated before buying cooking oil that morning. She said she had lived through periods of unrest before, and each time the first blow always landed on the household budget. Her story echoed across thousands of homes, reminding the nation that instability is never abstract. It touches the dinner table, the school day, the sense of normalcy parents work so hard to protect. Public transportation also slowed as security forces monitored major transit routes. Commuters grew anxious watching uniformed officers stand at intersections where they had not been seen before. Living through uncertainty creates a subtle but powerful psychological strain. It is the feeling that life can change at any moment, and that those changes are rarely for the better. Older citizens recognized this sensation immediately, recalling past decades when external interference stirred unrest across the region. These memories now blended with present anxieties, giving shape to a familiar fear that Benin's stability was never guaranteed, and that unseen forces could still test its foundations. Politically, the coup attempt exposed fractures that had long existed beneath the surface. Analysts pointed to groups inside the political and military establishment whose loyalties were divided. Some remained aligned with older alliances, while others leaned toward the rising regional movement focused on sovereignty and self-determination, the same spirit driving transformations in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. These differences had always existed, but the attempted coup amplified them. Suddenly, every political faction was forced to question the motives and loyalties of those around them. A former diplomat who once served in Benin's Ministry of Foreign Affairs explained it best. He said crises do not create divisions, they reveal them. According to him, the coup attempt did not succeed because it lacked broad support, but it succeeded in exposing how vulnerable the nation's institutions still were to external influence. Behind the scenes, lawmakers debated urgently about reforms that had been postponed for years. Strengthening oversight of military promotions, tightening controls over financial flows connected to foreign entities, and establishing clearer accountability systems became subjects of intense discussion. But as one senior advisor admitted privately, reform is easiest to discuss in calm times and hardest to achieve when shadows are moving. At the regional level, neighboring governments watched Benin closely. The coup attempt raised the alarming possibility that coastal West Africa might become the next theater for destabilization. For years, chaos had been concentrated in the Sahel, but now instability seemed to be approaching the Atlantic coast. Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo increased border monitoring, fearing that the tactics used in Benin might be tested elsewhere. These governments understood that a single successful coup in a strategically positioned nation could trigger a domino effect, encouraging opportunistic actors across the region. On the social front, young people became more vocal than ever. University students organized discussions about sovereignty and foreign influence, connecting Benin's experience to broader African shifts. Many referenced Ibrahim Traoré's speeches in Burkina Faso, noting that the struggle for autonomy was no longer confined to landlocked nations, but had now reached the coast. Their activism reflected a generation that refuses silence, a generation determined to challenge systems that once seemed immovable. Yet while youth movements gained momentum, older citizens carried a different kind of burden. They feared what instability could become if left unchecked. For them, memories of past conflicts were not history lessons, but lived experience. They worried not only about politics, but about safety, family, and the fragile peace that allows communities to survive. And in those quiet moments, when the nation held its breath, a larger question loomed. If Benin, a country long valued for its stability, could be shaken so quickly, what might happen to nations with even deeper vulnerabilities? This realization spread through households and ministries alike, turning the coup attempt into a regional alarm. The consequences were no longer limited to Benin's borders. The shock had rippled across West Africa, confronting every nation with a troubling truth. Stability in one country is bound to the stability of its neighbors, and where one tremor appears, more may follow. The most pressing question remained unspoken. How would the world, especially Western powers and the United States, interpret this moment? Would they see it as a warning or as an opportunity to reassert old influence? The answer would emerge swiftly, revealing just how entangled the future of Benin was with the interests of far more powerful nations. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction to the attempted coup in Benin was swift but noticeably cautious, a reflection of how sensitive West Africa has become in global strategy. For the United States, the stakes extend far beyond a single nation. American policymakers understand that instability in coastal West Africa can disrupt trade routes, empower extremist networks, threaten maritime security, and reshape alliances in ways that challenge long-standing U.S. interests. Officials at the State Department issued statements urging calm and respect for democratic institutions. But the language carried a familiar undertone. It echoed decades of diplomatic posture, one shaped by the belief that stability must be preserved even when the roots of instability are rarely addressed. For many older Americans who lived through the Cold War, the sentiment feels familiar. Small nations often become the ground where larger powers test their influence, and narratives of democracy or stability can mask deeper struggles for control. European governments expressed concern as well, but their reactions were even more revealing. France, in particular, responded with noticeable urgency, framing the event as a threat to regional order. For analysts who have followed Africa news closely, this signaled something important. The coup attempt tested not only Benin's internal resilience, but also the limits of Western influence in a region rapidly shifting toward new alliances. As West Africa strengthens ties with nations like China, Russia, and members of BRICS, many Western institutions find their influence diminishing. This makes moments like the Benin crisis a turning point, a test of whether old networks still possess the leverage they once relied on. For the United States, there is another dimension. Washington is increasingly aware that stability in Africa affects American families. Rising insecurity can contribute to global economic volatility, migration pressure, and the spread of foreign influence that challenges U.S. strategic interests. Retired military officers have warned for years that if the United States disengages or misreads African dynamics, other powers will fill the space quickly. This is why the Benin coup attempt captured attention far beyond the continent. It was not simply an African event. It was a signal that the geopolitical landscape is shifting faster than many expected. And as the world watched, one question became harder to ignore. Was this a moment of temporary unrest, or the beginning of a deeper struggle that could reshape Africa's relationship with global powers for a generation to come? The answer would depend on what happened next inside Benin itself, and whether the nation could withstand not only external pressure, but the internal weaknesses that shadowed its path toward sovereignty. As the tension in Benin slowly gave way to uneasy calm, one truth became impossible to ignore. The coup attempt was not an isolated spark. It was a sign of the deeper struggle unfolding across Africa, a struggle between nations seeking sovereignty and forces determined to keep them divided, predictable, and dependent. The shock of Benin's unrest revealed how fragile progress can be, and how quickly shadows from the past can re-emerge when a nation steps toward independence. For families across West Africa, the crisis was more than a political event. It was a reminder of how easily daily life can be disrupted when power is contested in ways ordinary people cannot see. And for older Americans watching from afar, many recognized echoes of moments they have lived through, times when foreign influence, covert operations, and geopolitical competition reshaped entire regions. Yet within this uncertainty, another truth has begun to rise. Africa is changing. From the Sahel to the Atlantic coast, nations like Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré have inspired a new consciousness, one that rejects fear and demands dignity. Young people are refusing silence. Communities are questioning narratives once accepted without hesitation. And the attempted coup in Benin, rather than weakening this awakening, may have strengthened it by revealing the tactics used to hold Africa in place. The danger now lies in what comes next. If Benin strengthens its institutions and seals the cracks that invited interference, the country could become a model for regional resilience. But if those weaknesses remain, Benin may face another test, one far more difficult than the first. And the same could be true for its neighbors, because instability rarely stops at one border. It spreads like a quiet tide, moving from one vulnerable point to the next. This raises a question that all of us must consider. Is Benin the beginning of a wider campaign to influence Africa's political future? Or is it the moment when African nations finally refuse to be shaped by forces beyond their control? The answer will determine not only the fate of Benin, but the trajectory of an entire continent. If this story has stirred something in you, perhaps a memory of times when freedom felt fragile, or when distant events carried consequences at home, take a moment to reflect on what it means for nations to stand firm in the face of pressure. Reflection is powerful, especially from those who have witnessed history more than once. And for those who believe in the strength that comes from faith, offer a quiet prayer for the people of Benin, and for all who seek peace in uncertain times. May they find the courage to protect their homes, their families, and their future. Africa stands at a turning point, and the awakening we are witnessing today may shape generations yet to come. The only question left is whether the world is ready for that awakening, or whether the shadows will move again.